Okay, let's unpack this. Get ready for a deep dive into a land that's, well, really been at the heart of Western civilization for millennia, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Thousands of years of history to get through.
And we've got quite the stack of sources here, historical overviews, ancient civilizations, empires, conflicts, right up to, well, today, really. So our mission today is to pull out the most important nuggets, the key insights from all this material, and sort of guide you through the incredible, complex, sometimes pretty tumultuous history of Greece.
From the very beginnings, myths and all, to where it sits in Europe now.
Exactly. So thinking about Greece, its whole long story, what jumps out at you first from these sources?
Oh, the first thing that really hits you is that incredible depth of history, obviously, but also just how much the geography shaped everything.
Right. Location, 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 even back then.
Totally. Greece, southern end of the Balkan Peninsula, seas all around, borders with other countries. It's about 51,500 square kilometers. And the population today, around 10.2 million, but get this, over 40% live near Athens. That's a huge concentration.
Wow, yeah.
But the real defining thing, geographically speaking, as the sources really emphasize, is the islands. Thousands of them.
Just scattered everywhere. And that fragmentation, it's not just pretty, is it? It's fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental. And the names, too, the sources mention, the Greeks called themselves Hellenes, their land Hellas.
Oh, but Greeks came later.
Yeah, from the Romans. Latin Graeci. Possibly from an old Greek word, graikos, meaning old man, though that's a bit uncertain.
Interesting. And Hellas pops up in Homer, right? The Iliad,
yeah.
the Odyssey. Which brings us to him.
Indeed. Homer, foundational figure, born maybe 850 BC, possibly Chios or Samos. The sources hedge their bets a bit. And his epics give us these incredible, though, complex glimpses into early Greek life. The Iliad, focusing on Troy, seems to reflect maybe an earlier age, feudal chieftains, that sort of thing.
While the Odyssey
feels a bit later. Odysseus's adventures, maybe reflecting more trade, the beginnings of city struggles. But the sources are careful. There's debate about dates, authorship, all that.
Standard academic stuff. But back to the geography for a second. Those mountains inside Greece, the sources stress they were serious barriers.
Huge barriers. Made it really tough for any one power to just roll over the rest. No easy conquest. Armies often had to split up.
Which helps explain why you get all those independent city-states later on, doesn't it?
Exactly. That fragmentation is often seen as a key factor. The sources also touch on early agriculture.
Right. They started out more pastoral.
Seems like it, yeah. Maybe less focused on soil fertility at first. It was a long, hard slog to make farming work on that dry, hilly land.
Terraces, embankments.
Reservoirs, the whole deal. There's even a saying mentioned that the Hellenes first taught men how to really till the ground properly. And farming quickly split, interestingly, into vine growing, which was quite specialized, and then sort of everything else.
And archaeology backs some of this up. The graves.
Yeah, copper and gold ornaments found in early graves. Suggests wealth, rich soil maybe, but also probably needing irrigation to get there.
But finding this stuff wasn't always popular.
Apparently not. Early attempts met with insouciance is the word the source uses, basically indifference. Until that rich German merchant Schliemann, though not named in this bit, published his findings from Troy and Mycenae, then boom, suddenly everyone's interested.
Right. And even the Greek government got involved, supporting later digs. Shows how perceptions changed.
Definitely. It really focused attention on those ancient roots, which leads us nicely into the different civilizations and periods the sources lay out for ancient Greece.
Okay, let's start where the sources do. The Minoans, described as Europe's earliest advanced civilization.
Right, on Crete. Flourishing roughly 2700 down to about 1400 BC. And the picture we get is from these excavated palatial centers.
What stands out?
The architecture, definitely. Those famous frescoes, distinctive pottery, and really elaborate artifacts, ivory, gold, clearly from skilled craft workshops. Plus, little objects giving hints about daily life.
And they had writing.
They did, lineae, used for administration, economy, that sort of thing. But the catch is, we haven't decoded it.
So we know what it was for, roughly, but not the specifics.
Exactly. We can't read the records themselves, but we know trade was huge for them.
Importing valuables.
Precious materials, knowledge from far away. Their location was key sea access, fertile land nearby, good links with neighbors even before they became really dominant.
And Crete was settled way earlier than the main Minoan period.
Oh yeah, Neolithic settlement around 7000 BC. Farmers from the North Aegean described as peaceful, making really fine pottery, little figurines.
And the Bronze Age built on that.
Continued refinement, yeah.
Okay.
Roughly 3,700 to 2,400 BC. And this is all happening against a backdrop of climate change getting warmer and drier.
And that's when we see the fancy stuff really take off.
Seems so. Clear evidence of goldsmithing, international trade, exporting jewelry, importing raw metals. The sources link this growing wealth directly to investment in really lavish architecture, public and private.
Mythical facades, elaborate decoration.
Exactly. A real sense of luxury, sophisticated material culture, even inventive dinnerware for, fancy meals. Mural painters were clearly highly regarded artisans.
But this luxury, it wasn't for everyone.
That's the fascinating contrast the sources highlight. You have this incredibly rich material culture for one class, clearly, but the remains of the rest, much simpler.
Just clay pots and graves.
Clay pots for the afterlife, yeah. And houses that supposedly didn't have doors designed for light and sanitation, but interestingly, the source says none of those actually remain today.
So a big gap between the elites and everyone else, visible even in the archaeology. Really makes you wonder about their society.
It absolutely does. There's a lot of questions. So after the Minoans, or overlapping somewhat, we get the rise of the Mycenaean civilization.
This is more mainland Greece, Aegean Islands.
Primarily, yes, though with influence reaching Anatolia and the Levant. Also Bronze Age. And the sources mark this period by distinct features. Growing urbanism, complex social structures.
Specialization in crafts, farming.
And crucially, the earliest forms of Greek writing.
Ah, okay. So where do we see the evidence?
Impressive palaces, again with frescoes Knossos on Crete, shows that Minoan influence continuing, but also places like Tiryns on the mainland, monumental tombs at Mycenae, full of rich grave goods.
And the writing system here. This one we can read.
Yes. That's the huge breakthrough. Linear B deciphered mid-20th century, and it turned out to be an early form of Greek.
So it wasn't Minoan?
Nope. Different language family. Linear B was mainly used for palace administration, keeping track of goods, personnel, that kind of thing. Deciphering it basically salvaged this lost world for us.
Wow, so it confirmed these complex urban societies existed.
Absolutely. On the mainland, islands, even connected to societies in Anatolia and the Levant. It seems likely linked to migrations, possibly Indo-European speakers arriving.
But this whole sophisticated world eventually collapsed.
It did, and the how and why are still a bit murky, though the sources say recent analysis is helping. We know that around 4,000 years ago, in the Middle Bronze Age, monumental architecture started appearing on the mainland, replacing earlier settlements.
And people were moving around.
Seems so. Permanent settlements popping up in the uplands between Thessaloniki and Athens, speaking maybe in early Greek. Agriculturalists expanding south, even raiding places like Crete.
And they had good boats, presumably.
Sophisticated maritime communication tech, yeah. The sources suggest this actually led to more collaboration for a while, before the whole system went down.
Okay, so after the Mycenaean collapse,
Yeah.
we hit the Dark Ages.
Right. Roughly 1100 to 800 BC. A period often described as, well, shadowy uncertainty. The Mycenaean palace system just broke down.
Life changes completely.
Totally. Palatial life vanished. Bronze gets largely replaced by wrought iron for tools and weapons. And critically, the art of writing linear B is lost.
Gone, just like that. Why?
The sources frame it, as you might expect, possibly a mix of internal corruption, societal decay, and external attacks, consistent with patterns seen elsewhere.
And newcomers arriving.
Yeah, an influx from the north. Some former Mycenaean subjects may be pushed west. You get more semi-nomadic groups wandering around western Greece and the Peloponnese for a while before eventually settling.
And settling into what kind of life?
Much more basic. Cattle breeding, pretty rudimentary pottery. Material culture definitely took a nosedive. Technical knowledge declined.
And with writing, gone. Back to oral tradition.
Seems so. Maybe simpler symbols, pictographs perhaps, suitable for that, but nothing like the complex syllabic linear B. Funerary practices also become much simpler, crude jars, ash heaps, instead of those big Mycenaean tombs.
Those small, isolated communities.
Small, unwalled, scattered, yeah, just focused on survival, basic farming, stock breeding, fishing, gathering, tame sheep and goats, hunting wild game.
Trade dries up. No fancy import.
Pretty much. No access to copper reserves either, so they apparently reverted to stone tools for some things. What copper they had was for essentials, weapons, basic utensils. Bronze and gold just became words for nice colors.
Wow, even religion changes.
Significantly, it seems. Simple stone altars, unadorned monuments later on. The sources suggest those later Olympian gods weren't the main focus then. It was more about appeasing the dead, venerating local heroes, fewer, simpler temples, a real contrast to the Mycenaean complexity. It paints a stark picture of regression.
Definitely. But eventually, things start picking up again, leading out of the Dark Ages into the Archaic period.
Exactly, starting around the early 7th century BC. And the pivotal development here, as we mentioned, is the Greek alphabet.
Adapted from the Phoenicians.
That's the consensus, yeah. A game changer. By the 6th century BC, you see Greek city-states, the poleis, really expanding. Founding colonies, Sicily, for example.
And industry picking up. Iron.
A flourishing iron industry, yeah. Providing resources, maybe even for warship artillery, the sources suggest.
So these poleis, they're trading, colonizing.
Getting heavily involved. But this expansion creates tensions back home. New money versus old money, basically. Merchants getting wealthy, bumping up against the traditional landowners and the aristocracy.
Leading to crises.
Big social crises in many cities, yeah. And the solution, often temporary, was the rise of tyrants.
Not necessarily tyrannical in our modern sense, initially.
Always no.
No.
Individuals who seized power, sometimes with popular backing at first, operating outside the old rules. Corinth, Megara, Sicyon, Miletus, Ephesus, lots of examples.
And what do they do with that power?
Accumulated wealth. Often through, taxes, the sources call extorted. They often allied with the merchants and ship owners against the aristocracy.
And they build things, public works.
Absolutely. Fountains, temples, public buildings, a way to legitimize their rule, perhaps. But tyranny often didn't last.
People revolted.
Frequently.
Yeah.
The sources mention a well-organized revolt in Corinth around 585 BC, kicking out Cypselus and his sons.
So what came after the tyrants?
Often these mixed systems, trying to balance the interests of all the groups, aristocrats, landowners, merchants, the common people.
And Athens takes a big step.
A huge step. Cleisthenes establishing democracy there in 508-507 BC. That's highlighted as a key moment, really setting the stage for a new kind of political culture.
And culturally, things are stirring too. Philosophy.
Big time. The 6th century sees the pre-Socratics, these early thinkers and poets. It's seen as heralding that golden age of science and philosophy to come.
New ideas about the gods, the universe.
New cosmogonies, yeah. And lyric poetry, like from the Seven Wise Men, expressing this new focus on ethos, what's just, what's unjust. Even the image of the gods changes, becoming more sober and restrained, yet still terrible and elegant. It suggests a shift tied to this new civic and ethical thinking. Fascinating how it all connects.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the big one, the classical period, the Golden Age. Roughly 5th to 4th centuries BC.
That's the core period, yes. And the sources make a really bold claim here. This era is the absolute foundation of Western civilization.
Wow. They argue things like Roman law, the Renaissance, scientific method. None of it possible without this.
That's the argument presented, yeah. It's a powerful assertion.
And the reason why it matters so much, according to them.
It's not just about the duration. It was only about 2 centuries, relatively short. The marvel was the society they built. Imperfect, sure, but an effective way of organizing human relationships and what the sources call a satisfactory government for incredibly talented people.
And the output was just staggering.
Unbelievable. Materially, you get wonders like the Parthenon. Intellectually, well, the dramas of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, still powerful today.
Philosophy, Socrates, Plato. History, Herodotus, Thucydides, science, Archimedes, Eratosthenes.
The list goes on and on. Achievements across the board that have, as the sources say, stood the test of centuries.
And it wasn't just Athens, right? Sparta played a role.
Absolutely. Sparta, the great military power, known for its intense discipline. And the sources make an interesting point about Greek art generally.
Oh, so.
Unlike many cultures where art was mainly to glorify kings or warriors, Greek art adorned civic and religious buildings, reflecting community focus.
Right. And their genius created drama, used for religion, but also literature.
Both, yeah. Tragedy especially is called perhaps the greatest flower of the age, reflecting national and universal themes, still resonates.
The sources say dramatic art from then hasn't really been surpassed.
It's a strong claim, but understandable given the impact. The Iliad, the tragedies, the comedies still read, studied, offering insights into Greek life, but also just universal human stuff.
And even before that peak, the architecture had its distinct style.
Simplicity, symmetry, modesty, temples, house, statues. The statues were venerated, not necessarily the building itself, and they faced east to the rising sun.
Greek sculpture, that balance between realistic and ideal.
In marble and bronze, yeah. And painting, though less survives, ancient accounts describe it as highly skilled.
So this whole period, roughly Xerxes' death to Alexander's death,
Yeah.
Athens under Pericles at its peak.
Right.
That's the heart of the Golden Age.
That's the core definition used, yes. The zenith of Hellenic civilization. And classical itself becomes the term for these masterworks, the standard others look to.
But as Golden Ages do, it didn't last forever. Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. And then what?
Then his massive empire basically falls apart pretty quickly, actually. His generals, the sources named Didymus, Antigonus, Cassander, among others, carve it up.
Fighting amongst themselves?
Oh, yeah. Hostile camps, lots of wars. And that vibrant Greek polis system, the independent city-state, it loses a lot of its vitality compared to the classical era.
And the center of learning shifts.
Big time. Athens remains important, sure, but the main intellectual hub becomes Alexandria in Egypt, home of the Great Library.
Okay. And then, about 150 years later, Rome enters the picture.
The rising power of Rome, yeah. Sweeps across the Mediterranean, eventually absorbs Greece into its empire.
An empire that lasted much longer than Alexander's.
Much longer. And that Hellenistic culture that spread after Alexander, it didn't just disappear. It continued to influence and kind of percolate through the Roman world.
Which brings us neatly to Roman Greece, kicking off officially around 146 BC after Rome defeats Macedon.
Right. Greece becomes a Roman province, but, and this is crucial, a very different kind of province.
So?
Unlike many places Rome conquered, Greek language, Greek culture, that whole long history of sophistication, it was largely left intact. Admired, even.
That's a key distinction. So Greeks become Roman citizens.
And Greek continues as an administrative language alongside Latin, especially in the East. Rome even adopts Greek gods into its pantheon, mostly. A generally liberal religious policy. Only one deity really transformed significantly.
And Greek culture heavily influences Rome.
Hugely. Roman literature, mythology.
Right.
Roman elites often protected Greek traditions, studied philosophy with Greek teachers. Greeks weren't barred from office either. The sources mention a Greek commanding the Roman navy.
Cool.
Downtays.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Governing Greece was hard.
Definitely challenging, partly because of that deep-rooted Greek love of liberty. The sources mention there were cases of governors being kicked out, even killed.
Internal squabbles didn't help either, presumably.
No, Greek quarrels, their own evolving ideas about government, plus what the sources call the debasement of luxury, maybe excessive wealth, causing problems. It all complicated things for Roman administrators. They had to make changes, create new administrative divisions called demons.
So the conquest itself, it was gradual, not one big war.
Gradual, yeah. Starting around 200 BC, Rome kept intervening in the politics of the existing Hellenistic kingdoms, often saying they needed to restore peace. Eventually subdued the major Greek leagues.
Key steps involved capturing cities, sieges.
Capturing cities of the Achaean League, suppressing the siege of Corinth, eventually destroying Corinth, and then the Senate formally dividing Greece into provinces.
And the sources highlight one battle in particular. Cynocephalae.
Yes, 197 BC. Romans defeat Philip V of Macedon. And what's interesting is how the source points out its huge significance for Roman dominance, but contrasts it with Marathon or Salamis, suggesting it's often overlooked.
Right. Less famous, but maybe more decisive in this context.
Quite possibly. Described as unplanned, messy, fought on rugged terrain near Thessaloniki where the Macedonian phalanx couldn't really deploy properly. Cavalry wasn't effective either.
And despite some initial Macedonian success.
The Romans won decisively, a key step towards controlling Greece.
Okay. And during this Roman period, the sources also look back at the classical age again, reminding us of things like the Athenian fleet.
Yeah, Themistocles, the fleet, the huge victory at Salamis against the Persians, and the aftermath, the Persians ravaging the land, sacking the Acropolis, described as one of the saddest chapters.
But leading to that incredible rebuilding under Pericles. The Propylaea, Erechtheium, and the Parthenon.
Exactly. And the sources give details on the Parthenon Doric style, columns, Phidias's massive ivory and gold statue of Athena inside, 40 feet high, and his Zeus at Olympia, too.
Plus that amazing frieze around the outside.
The Panathenaic procession depicted, priests, horsemen, maidens, animals for sacrifice. 365 feet long. Incredible detail.
So, Roman administration. It lasted a long time.
roughly 1,200 years in some form. Initially, Greece was part of large provinces. After 27 BC, they get divided into imperial and senatorial provinces, governed a bit differently.
Run by Roman governors sent from Rome.
Governors and officials, yeah. No standing army stationed there as such, but inspections, drafts for service or supplies. Their main job: keep the peace, get resources, money, land, men for the empire.
Usually a one-year term.
Typically, yeah. Proconsular powers. The sources suggest that later on, maybe the system changed due to Rome's own civil wars, leading to governors being less experienced, relying on second-hand laws compared to earlier proconsuls from the Senate.
And this caused problems. Unrest.
The sources hint at that, yeah.
Yeah.
Attributing some unrest in the senatorial provinces to the sterile ignorance and sullenness of some administrators suggests a disconnect, maybe arrogance, causing friction despite general contentment with Roman rule itself.
Okay, so jumping forward quite a bit now, we get to the Byzantine period. Starts roughly 330 AD with Constantinople.
That's the usual marker, yeah. Emperor Constantine founding his new capital on the site of Old Byzantium. And the location was just incredible.
Between Europe and Asia, controlling the Black Sea.
Absolutely strategic. Destined to be the greatest city, one source says.
And moving the capital east was huge for preserving Greek heritage.
Immensely important. Within the Byzantine Empire, those classical traditions, history, culture, religion, art, they were kept alive, built upon, transmitted, even as the political center shifted away from Rome itself.
So you see Byzantine institutions forming. Administration, military.
And crucially, Christianity becomes dominant, gradually replacing the old pagan cults and myths. New Greek art forms develop based on classical roots, but evolving. Right. And Greek remains the language of literature of the state in the East.
And Byzantine Greece had its own golden age.
It did, yeah. A commercial and cultural flourishing, 9th to 12th centuries. A major European center. Lots of monuments from that time still stand today.
But then decline sets in.
Yeah.
After the 12th century.
Yeah. And then real chaos after 1204, the Fourth Crusade, when the Western Crusaders actually sacked Constantinople.
Right, so Greek lands get split up.
Fragmented. Divided between the crusading Franks and various Byzantine Greek families trying to hold on. You get about 200 years of Latin occupation in many areas. Only a few pockets remain under direct Byzantine rule. New centers emerge like Mistras, but they're often far from the old heartlands.
And the end of the Byzantine Empire? The sources give slightly different dates.
Yeah, one mentions the fall of Nicopolis in 1476, but the more common endpoint, and the one marking the start of Ottoman rule over most of Greece, is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Important to note, both are mentioned as significant endings in the source material.
But even under foreign rule later, that Byzantine identity persisted.
Here.
Christian, Orthodox.
Retained its core character, yeah, through what the sources call a long period of darkness. But foreign rule obviously transformed everything: society, economy, culture. Greek fades from state affairs in the capital, now Istanbul. Hellenism goes into a kind of exile. A large diaspora forms.
Before we fully move past Byzantium, the sources backtrack a bit to the city's origins. Before it was Constantinople.
Right. Founded as a Byzantium way back, around 657 BC, by Greeks from Megara. Same time as places like Olympia and Delphi were founded.
And its location was key from the start.
Absolutely. Bosphorus, Propontis, natural protection, controlling shipping. It became a prosperous trading city pretty early on, by the 5th century BC.
But faced threats.
Persians.
Yeah, Darius tried, Xerxes laid siege. The sources suggest these kinds of conflicts actually spurred advances in town planning in Greece. Big building projects, walls, palaces, increasing rulers' power, changing society.
And then Constantine chooses it in 330 AD. New Rome.
Transformative moment. That location again. Built up over generations at fabulous expense, massive walls, aqueduct, churches, theaters, palaces, hippodrome, the works. Though maybe initially it seemed a bit small and vulnerable.
Okay. And the sources also circle back to the classical golden age here, adding more detail on that cultural flourishing. Yeah, defining it again from Xerxes' death 465 BC to Alexander's 323 BC. Pericles, Athens at its peak, the zenith of Hellenic civilization.
We covered the big names: drama, philosophy, history.
Right, and reiterating that classical refers to these specific acclaimed works, seen as norms, widely imitated.
And the architecture? Simplicity, symmetry. Temples, housing venerated statues. Sculpture balancing realism and idealism. Painting highly skilled, based on descriptions.
And the key point again, art serving the community, civic and religious buildings, not just glorifying rulers, drama as a unique invention for religious and literary expression, tragedy as perhaps the pinnacle.
Still studied today for those universal themes.
Exactly, illuminating Greek life, but also just the human condition.
Which brings us back starkly to 1453, the fall of Constantinople. The sources paint a vivid picture.
Very vivid. Mentions the great cathedral, Hagia Sophia, reports of troops gathering, ships arriving.
Sultan Mehmed II preparing the siege.
Grand arrangements, drums, war horses. Then the capture on May 21st. The description is really harrowing.
Holy Church sullied, people maddened, sadness on faces.
Most beautiful city changed, wondrous buildings ruined, palace sealed. And that line about deep waters crying really captures the sense of loss, the start of oppression.
A definitive end to Byzantium and the beginning of Ottoman Greece.
For most of the region, yes, lasting until the early 19th century.
So the Ottomans, they emerged from the chaos after Byzantium's decline.
Yeah, dominant power in the Eastern Med. Started as raiders north of the Black Sea, united under Osman Bey. Moved fast, took Byzantine lands in Thrace, made Aduan their capital even before Constantinople fell.
And 1453 solidifies their control.
Over most of the former Byzantine territory, yeah. They kept expanding, taking Crete much later, 1669.
And how did they rule?
From the 16th century on, Sultan is a despot. Elaborate bureaucracy, Grand Vizier, the Devshirme system recruiting Christian boys for the Janissary Corps, provincial governors collecting taxes, running things locally.
But it wasn't always smooth. Resistance.
Lots of unrest. Sources cite callous misgovernment, neglected lands, and especially exorbitant taxation on Greeks in European Turkey. Defiance was met harshly, settlements raised sometimes, but uprisings kept happening.
So what was life like for Greeks under Ottoman rule?
From the late 14th century onwards, the sources describe it as becoming subaltern, oppressed, less visible in public life as the state became more Turkish in character. Withdrawal from public life became a kind of survival strategy.
But not just passive withdrawal. Cultural creativity continued.
Yes, interestingly. The sources draw parallels with Jewish, Armenian experiences maintaining identity under foreign rule. Hellenic enclosures, maybe communities, schools. The church fostered ideas, kept culture alive, nurtured by Greeks abroad too, intertwined with folklore. This eventually fed into modern nationalism, a way of pushing back against repression.
Which leads inevitably to the Greek War of Independence, 1821 to 1833.
Right. After centuries of Ottoman rule, there had been earlier revolts, mid-17th century, often involving outside powers like Venice, Austria, Russia. Russia gained influence after 1774.
And the Ottomans tightened the screws in response.
Seems so. Lifted some old Greek privileges. The main push for revolution came from that secret society, Philic Eteria, the Friendly Society.
And it kicks off where?
Peloponnese, March 1821, spreads quickly to central Greece.
And they try to form a state quickly.
Yeah, National Assembly at Epidaurus, January 1822, proclaimed independence, drafted a constitution, but international support was limited at first, and crucially, there was a lot of Greek infighting until about 1826.
Meanwhile, the Ottomans hit back hard. Chios.
The fall of Chios, July 1822, is highlighted as particularly brutal. Great slaughter, a real low point.
But eventually, foreign help arrives.
Gradually. Russia, Britain, France. Not full military force initially, but later ships. Men, the Philhellenic movement. Humanitarian aid, too, a committee in London from 1823. Fighting continues. New constitution in 1823, well into the late 1820s.
But by then, independence is basically a fact on the ground.
De facto, yeah. Though the final borders were still debated, Crete and Cyprus notably left out of the new Greek state.
So 1821, 1833 is about state building, getting recognition. Navarino was key.
Battle of Navarino, 1827. The great powers' fleets destroy the Ottoman Egyptian fleet. That was decisive in forcing recognition of Greek autonomy.
Leading to the Kingdom of Greece.
Yeah.
With a foreign king.
Yes, Otto of Bavaria. Initially a Bavarian regency for 6 years. First attempts at liberalization, more territory gained. The 1840s see the basics of a modern state schools, national bank, centralized government.
But Otto becomes unpopular, too authoritarian.
Increasingly so, yeah. Led to a popular uprising in 1862, forced him out.
And so we enter the era of modern Greece, post-1821, first Balkan nation to break free.
A huge symbolic moment. But the sources note Turkish policy often leaned on Greece regarding the wider Balkan question, forcing the new kingdom onto its own resources a lot.
The kingdom gets founded, gets a constitution, influenced by European revolutions.
Definitely. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire is seen as decaying, vulnerable. The Greek Revolution involved intense struggle, lots of bloodshed before the pashas gave way. Greece got independence, but maybe only half the territory they wanted initially.
In that source statement about Constantinople being in Greek hands once more.
Yeah, that seems more like a reflection of historical aspiration or sentiment within that specific source rather than the reality of 1821. Constantinople remained Ottoman.
Gotcha. So, focusing on the actual state building, propaganda was important.
Crucial. The Greeks used pamphlets, appeals extensively. One source from 1826 even lamented that while Greeks won battles, Turks were winning the war because the Greeks failed to win the nation's gain. Allies treated them like enemies. Shows awareness of needing more than just military wins.
So early pamphlets were aimed at Europe, appealing for help.
Exactly. Like the one by Chief Priest Germanos focused on moral legitimacy, national independence, not battlefield tactics. Others detailed Greek suffering, urged intervention. The revolutionaries' call to arms in May 1821 invited all Greeks to fight, and committees wrote directly to powers like France and Britain seeking alliance and aid.
Okay, jumping ahead to the early 20th century, the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913.
Significant expansion for Greece. Tensions were high among Balkan states over former Ottoman lands, issues like Crete.
Where Greece had growing influence.
Yeah. Greece allies with Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro against the Ottomans. Treaties aimed to redistribute territory. Key battles like Kumanovo, Treaty of Bucharest gives Greece more land, including Thessaloniki, big celebrations there.
But success creates new problems, the conflicts with neighbors.
Over the new territories, yeah. And internally, things get polarized. King George I assassinated in 1913. His son Constantinos I is less decisive. Second Balkan War in 1913 deepens the divide.
The split between the king and Venizelos.
The national schism, yeah. King Constantinos leaning pro-German royalist. Prime Minister Venizelos pro-Entente constitutionalist. Venizelos wins initially, prepares for war, but the king fires him. Greece stays neutral when WWI breaks out.
Until
1917. Constantinos abdicates, Venizelos returns, brings Greece into the war on the winning side, playing a key role in the Ottoman-German defeat.
Then comes World War II. Invasion, occupation.
April 1941. Fascist Italy, then Nazi Germany, brutal occupation, country split into zones. Resistance forms ELAS, communist-led, EAS, Republican nationalists.
And the rivalry between them leads to
civil war. Even before the occupiers fully left, tensions exploded. The sources mention Greece technically becoming a republic in 1944, but the situation was incredibly volatile, and the Civil War raged intensely after that. The monarchy eventually came back.
So the Civil War. The sources focus heavily on the Communist Party, CPG, and ELAS.
They do. By 1944, ELAS controlled much of the countryside, organizing social life in villages. But the sources also state they actively repressed other resistance groups. The British, arriving after the Germans left, struggled to influence lights.
One source suggests the CPGAS deliberately stoked conflict in 1946.
Yes, one perspective offered is that they precipitated conflicts, annihilating democratic forces while appealing for intervention. They declared war on the Greek state in September 1946.
And gained ground initially.
According to that source, yes, winning control in areas like Western Macedonia, Thessaly, Peloponnese, setting up a revolutionary government in liberated provinces, described harshly as being under savage repression. Again, it's vital to remember these are highly contested interpretations from the sources.
The Greek state gets limited help at first, but pushes back later.
Yes. Had to threaten action to stop attacks on cities in winter 46-47. There were early suspicions about CPG motives, too. Propaganda about King George II's return seemed odd. Newspapers doubted the NLF's unity, fearing a communist takeover. Tensions with Britain were high. Disputed elections in early 46 added to the mess.
A really complex, tragic period. The sources also include a specific anecdote about King George II visiting Kythera.
Yes, a very striking narrative account. First king there since ancient times, apparently. Crowd, music, hushed arrival.
But the source interprets it very critically.
Extremely critically. Describes the king's speech as like a wreath for his own head, empty ceremony. Notes he approved death penalties the same day. Officials get gold wreaths. The king looks confused they aren't for him. A passing shadow on his face.
Wow. And the interpretation.
Sees the whole thing, the talk of a neo-Hellenic Renaissance, as hollow plausibilities. The wreaths chaffing the king like a burden, frames it poetically as Greece at the dusk of liberalism, dawn for fascism, something not to be honored. It's clearly one specific, highly symbolic, and negative viewpoint on the monarchy and the political climate then. Reflects the deep divisions of the time.
Absolutely. Okay, moving into more recent times, the economic crisis after 2008 looms large in the sources. The impact of the Troika's memoranda.
Described as devastating, nearly half the population ending up on unemployment databases, thousands of skilled people leaving a massive brain drain to Germany, Canada, Australia.
Greek industry hit hard.
Abrupt demise is the phrase used. Shipping, textiles, tourism just barely hanging on.
And the social impact.
Widespread despair and hopelessness, deep frustration with the political system, an ambiguous sense of politics, just a really profound shock.
Leading to a lot of soul searching, reevaluating everything.
Exactly. Education, science, identity itself. Intellectuals trying to understand contemporary Greek identity, its roots, its current state. Academic debate continues a long tradition of grappling with this identity problem.
And it's tied to Greece's place in history, its vectoriality in space and time.
Yeah, basically asking, what does it mean to be Greek now? What is modern Greece, historically, culturally? What's its future? And the sources stress what happens in Greece affects Europe, too.
Which raises that big question.
Yeah.
How does that incredibly long, complex history, ancient glory, foreign rule, struggle shape this identity question today?
It creates this incredibly layered foundation, doesn't it? The sources point to EU membership in 1981 as a huge starting point.
A period of revitalization?
Modernization.
Socioeconomic revitalization, yeah. Infrastructure improving, inequalities lessening somewhat, attitudes changing. European integration was seen by some as a way to safeguard a fragile identity within the modern state structure.
Rapid development for a few years gave an impression of a comeback. Miraculous redress, 1981-86. Positioned Greece as an example for other Mediterranean states joining Europe. But the debate continues in Athens. European identity versus the harsh reality of economic crisis, being on the disastrous semi-periphery.
A paradoxical integration.
That's how the sources put it. A late entrant restructuring its economy, carrying this unique historical weight. Greece's place in Europe includes and exceeds the terms for other Mediterranean nations.
And the economic crisis itself, triggered by the global meltdown, but with deep local roots.
Coincided with 2007-2008, yeah. Global turbulence hit hard. But Greece had its own structural issues. Massive public and private debt, exchange rate problems, credit rating issues. The sources mention the sudden stop dynamic, a boom-bust cycle made worse by globalization and easy credit beforehand.
So foreign money dried up.
Suddenly stopped flowing in. Combined with existing imbalances, it caused a liquidity crisis for banks. Credit froze, deep recession, unemployment soared, austerity hit hard. Fundamentals had been deteriorating, raising doubts about debt sustainability, government solvency.
And Greek banks were heavily exposed.
They'd invested heavily in Greek government debt, which used to be highly rated, cheap to borrow against. When budget numbers tanked, markets panicked. Downgrades followed, creating a vicious cycle between sovereign debt risk and bank solvency.
A downward spiral.
Exactly. Fears about Greek debt and banks spread, threatening the whole Eurozone, even the global economy for a while. Contagion risk was huge.
Yet, despite all that economic turmoil, culture and tourism remain vital.
Absolutely central.
Yeah.
A national priority. Greece is famous for leisure tourism, drawing on those incredible natural and cultural resources.
3,500 plus years of civilization.
Monuments, archaeological sites, museums, traditional villages, just an abundance. Plus the natural beauty landscapes, beaches, coves, parks, islands, olive groves.
And climate helps.
Ideal climate, yeah. Longer summers, milder winters. Promoting Greece for leisure, business, sports, education has been a consistent government policy for decades.
Supported by tourism bodies, marketing.
Ministry of Tourism, GNTO, regional bodies, all pushing it. Infrastructure like airports is key. 32 airports, lots getting international charters, clustered to improve access.
And lots of smaller businesses providing services.
Loads of small and medium tourism enterprises, yeah. Accommodation is vast, over 9,600 units, 770,000 plus beds. Though the sources note a majority are in the lower star categories, 2-star or less. So, wrapping this all up, what does this massive journey tell us? Thousands of years.
Minoans, Mycenaeans, the classical Golden Age, Roman, Byzantine empires, Ottoman rule, independence, modern challenges, economic crisis, identity questions.
It's a history, as this deep dive shows, marked by just incredible innovation, amazing cultural resilience against huge pressures, constant struggle, and adaptation.
Right. That ancient legacy is undeniable, influencing Western thought, governance, everything. But the Greece of today, it's a product of so much more, isn't it? Tumultuous change, foreign domination, internal conflict, modern pressures.
And that's what's so fascinating, isn't it? How a nation's identity gets forged from such disparate threads. Ancient glory, imperial subjecthood, centuries of being ruled by others, then the intense struggles and sharp shocks of modernity.
It really defies any simple label.
It truly does.
So here's where it gets really interesting, the final thought to leave you with. Given this extraordinary, almost unbelievable history of adaptation, resistance, massive shifts in power, culture, economy, how might this idea of modern Greece continue to evolve?
Its identity, its role, its future.
Especially navigating its complex position within Europe and the wider world today, how does a place with that much history continue to write its next chapter?
That's definitely something to ponder long after we finish this deep dive.